Hello and welcome to this exclusive showcase version of Solar Energy, the Route to Net Zero, a programme collaboration between Solar Energy UK and ITN Productions.
Solar energy now provides 5% of the UK's power output, and since 2019 there's been no government subsidy. In this programme we've been finding out how solar will play a huge part in achieving net zero goals.
We expect the industry to triple its capacity in the next 10 years, so that will be around 10–15% of all UK power output from solar.
And how new homes from 2030 are likely to be smart and solar.
The exciting thing about solar is that when it's integrated from the start, it really creates a sustainable solution.
At this leading motorsports company in Worcestershire, they have installed around 260 solar panels on the roof that generate in excess of 40 kilowatts all day, every day in good weather. They use battery storage by Solar X Power to capture the excess energy, halving bills.
So we're really seeing benefits from absolutely day one of installing it. It was remarkable.
This is the Army's first solar farm project in East Yorkshire. It's a collaboration with Centrica, an energy services and solutions company.
It's been a pleasure working with them, to be honest. The Army's committed to 76 solar sites nationally. We're a hugely diverse estate.
Batteries are used to store energy.
We think hydrogen also has an important role to play in that form of power storage. And we think when there's too much power on the grid, once we have the ability to store that hydrogen, we can convert that renewable power into hydrogen and then to be used for transport, for heating or power generation.
Centrica wants to convert Easington Gas Terminal into the UK's biggest hydrogen depository, enough to heat 1 million homes for up to a year. Businesses need to hit net zero targets. Voltalia produces and sells electricity generated from solar, which it owns and operates.
Voltalia are working with the City of London Corporation. We're building a project and will supply over half of their electricity. And from a City of London's point of view, the benefit is a renewable source of energy to hit net zero targets. It reduces their exposure to price volatility. And also it's a good commercial package.
To have a real impact, the solar energy industry needs to triple in size over the next decade.
With a few policy changes, modest ones, we believe we can treble it. That would create 13,000 new jobs in the UK. It would create £17 billion worth of economic value. And it would, because whenever solar is on the grid, it displaces gas power, it actually will reduce our emissions by 4.7% in the decade.
Global technology company Huawei is using its expertise in digital information technology and research and development to transform the renewable energy sector.
So for Huawei, we already set our target clear. Digital power is the future of our planet and ourselves, and we will be investing heavily into this.
And up to 15% of its annual revenue goes into research and development. At this electric forecourt in Essex, you'll find 36 charging points powered by a solar panel roof and a solar farm up the road.
All of the energy that people use at grid-served infrastructure in the UK is either zero carbon or net zero carbon, and we deliver that because of solar energy.
Solar Energy UK's Lighting the Way report explains how to speed up clean energy production to meet our net zero goals.
With an ambitious government, experts, including the Climate Change Committee, expect solar combined with wind to be able to provide up to 90% of the UK's electricity needs by 2035. That's huge.
This is the UK's largest solar farm ever constructed and energised, which is called Llanwern. It's helping to support the unique biodiversity in South East Wales.
It's a section of land, 200 acres in this case, taken out of the agricultural intensive farming cycle and then maintained with low traffic over a long horizon. And that means you can really do impressive things with biodiversity.
The force behind Llanwern is Next Energy Capital.
Obviously, we are taking the E in ESG, there's no problem there, but the fact that we look at the S and the G and take that so seriously as well, and we've a dedicated team for that and also got a very good track record.
It's hoped this approach will help to power the solar energy revolution.
Thanks so much for joining me for this exclusive showcase version of Solar Energy, the Route to Net Zero. From all of us here, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.
Good afternoon and welcome to you all to, I'm delighted really to welcome you to Glasgow. We have a studio audience as well as a live stream, and this afternoon we're going to be speaking to a whole range of truly inspirational leaders in the solar industry about what we are doing as an industry about climate change. Coming here, we're hearing a lot of shocking numbers around climate change. You will hear a lot of numbers. We'll hear the millions of lives at risk. We will hear the square miles of forest fires that are threatened. We'll hear about the billions of subsidies which are still pouring in to the fossil fuel industry. But coming here, I find the most disturbing number I find here is the one we see on the banners all around the city, which is 26, COP26. So here we are, we've had these gatherings now every year since 1995, world leaders trying to prevent climate change. That's half of my lifetime. It's my entire career, effectively, and I've been working on this issue for that whole career. The problem is getting more severe, and it's becoming more urgent. So it's not really any wonder that we hear the phrase blah, blah, blah an awful lot this week. Climate change is a slow-moving crisis, but the political response has still failed to keep pace with it. And the power of those who want to prevent change has still held sway. But the pace of climate change is picking up. This year's dramatic weather events really prove that beyond any doubt. Earlier this year, the town of Lytton in North Canada was made famous for being the hottest place in Canada at 49 degrees, a real sort of a world record for that part of the world. 2 days later, it burned to the ground. This is a very urgent problem. It's happening in Siberia, in Greece, in Australia, across the world. Our house literally is burning down. But the solutions are moving faster than we'd hoped as well, and sometimes driven by policy and sometimes just the technology itself and the momentum behind that development. What makes it really exciting to work in the renewable energy sector is the more we build, the cheaper it becomes. The cheaper it becomes, more investment flows. We are now in that virtuous circle which is starting to bear fruit. In COP16, we could not have imagined how fast solar and wind have developed over the last decade. The cost of solar alone has dropped by 90% in 10 years. This year, the UK government named solar as the cheapest form of power generation, bar none, in the country. The IEA, which spent most of the decade underestimating the ability of solar to deploy, now calls the technology the king of electricity and expects a huge global growth. So the last 10 years have created a great deal of hope, and the next 10 years have to deliver on that hope. In COP26, I hope we'll hear speeches about this event in this city as the turning point of the climate change debate. But whatever happens in the building behind us, the solar industry and the wider renewable sector will be delivering solutions on land, on buildings, in homes, faster and faster rates throughout this decade. The UK summers regularly now see solar creating 25% of the UK's power in certain parts of the day during the summer. South Australia, there was a moment in South Australia this year where it was 100% of the entire state's energy came from solar. Extraordinary statistics. And yet we barely scratched the surface. It's still a young technology. So in this country, we hope to triple the capacity of solar energy from 14 gigawatts, it is now, to 40 gigawatts by 2030. That's in line with the Climate Change Committee scenarios and advice for the net zero target for 2050 and for the carbon budgets between now and then. That would probably mean that at least 10%, probably more than 10% of all our power will be coming from solar. That includes the extra power we're going to need for electric vehicles, for heat electrification during the next decade. Alongside similar and possibly even greater growth from wind and energy storage, the renewable sector will become the energy industry by the end of this decade. So we will be cutting our dependence on fossil fuels. We'll be cutting our dependence on that price volatility. We'll be cutting our dependence on the political influence of the companies who own those fossil fuel reserves. So today and tomorrow at Glasgow, we'll be hearing from current industry leaders about the pace of that change, about how it can be achieved and what other benefits there are, not just the carbon benefits, but the jobs, the investment, the lower energy bills, the increase in the value of people's properties, and the biodiversity benefits too. We'll have two panels. We have one on the utility scale, which we'll come to in a moment, and then we'll have another one looking at the rooftop solar and energy storage sector. I'm particularly grateful for these events today and the ones tomorrow for a number of leaders who've helped to sponsor these events. So Next Energy, GridServe, Huawei, CGen, HBS, New Energies, Voltalia and Sonadix. You'll be hearing from a number of them today and some of our events tomorrow as well. I'm really delighted as well that we will be having a presentation and a keynote speech from Lord Deben, who is chair of the Climate Change Committee. He is, I understand now, currently stuck in traffic, but he is going to be joining us later on. So we're going to have the panel first, and then after that panel, we will have Lord Deben speak to us. And Lord Deben is a doyen of the climate change industry, a climate change sector. He's steeped in this debate. He, I think I'm right in saying, was the leader of the delegation in the first COP. So he really does have a lot to say about this issue, and we're really delighted that he's going to be joining us today. But we'll pause there. We'll pause for a couple of minutes whilst we reshuffle the panel, and we'll bring on the next set of speakers. So we'll be with you very soon.
Welcome back, everyone online, and welcome again to everyone joining us here in the studio today. My name's Cam Whitten, and I'm the head of policy at Solar Energy UK. We are coming to you live from the Energy Transition Hub here at COP. We are right across the river from the Blue Zone, which, as folks know, is the beating heart, the epicenter of where the climate negotiations are taking place over the next 2 weeks. For those of you who don't know Solar Energy UK, we are the industry body representing the whole solar value chain in the UK. So that's everything from large-scale developers, which we'll be talking about specifically on this panel, all the way down to commercial and residential rooftop businesses as well. And that includes not only solar PV, but solar thermal and energy storage, and a whole host of complementary technologies, which I'm sure we'll be getting into today. Thank you again to RES for hosting us in this brilliant space, and thank you again to the organizers, Energy UK, Renewable UK, and the sponsors for pulling all this together. So this panel is going to be focused on lighting the way to net zero, I think is the catchy title we've come up with for this session. Basically, we're talking about how we get from here to there and how solar can really drive the energy transition and drive the delivery of net zero at the pace that the UK government has set for themselves. I'm joined today by a brilliant panel of experts across the sector who we'll come to in a moment. But just to introduce them briefly for you, we've got Ross Greer, who's Managing Director at Next Energy Capital. We've got Lucy Whitford, who is the Managing Director of Development and Construction at RES. We've got Sam Cranston, who is a Director at Copper Consultancy, and Toddington Harper, who is the CEO of GridServe. Now, just to do a bit of scene setting for everyone, I think by now, hopefully everyone knows that the net zero target date that the UK government has set is 2050. But that's a long way off still, and to really make that digestible and meaningful, we need to think about nearer term targets. So there's a couple of other targets that they've set for themselves just recently. A key one is the fact that we've committed to decarbonizing the grid entirely by 2035, so that's a little bit more on the horizon. We've also set for ourselves under the 6th carbon budget this year an objective to reduce emissions by 78% by that same year, by 2035. And what we've said as a sector is that we're committing to delivering 40 gigawatts of solar by 2030, which is in line with what the committee, the Climate Change Committee has said is necessary to keep us on track for that 2050 target. So what does that actually mean? Where do we need to accelerate growth? Because if you break it down, we've got 14 gigawatts installed in the ground, as Chris said, already. If we're looking at getting to that number over the next 8 or so years, we're talking about a pretty rapid build rate. We're installing loads of solar. We've now got well over a gigawatt of subsidy-free solar in the ground, which is a brilliant achievement in the post-subsidy world. But we need to go faster, we need to go further, and I think that's really what this summit is highlighting thus far. So I think to kick off with our panelists, I just want to go through and let everyone introduce themselves, say a bit more about who they are, what their role is, sort of what your priorities are currently, and a bit more about where your focus is as a company, and then come on to sort of what you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities for the sector in the near term, but also in the long run. So Toddington, we'll come to you first.
Great. Hi. So, we are extremely upbeat about the prospects for solar. We're very sure we can deliver, the targets and hopefully above and beyond that that have been set. And that's because solar energy is now a low-cost form of energy. My father was installing solar panels about 50 years ago, and they were 99.5% more expensive than they are today, which is just really incredible. But he was combining them with batteries because that made the energy more useful. And batteries were very, very expensive then too. And where we are today is we're at the point where solar is now a low-cost form of energy. It's produced locally. You don't need to, rely on oil wells and oil pipes and so on, and tankers. And batteries are also, low cost now and becoming lower cost. And the combination of the two makes them very, very useful. So what we're doing is we're actually building what we call a sun-to-wheel kind of new energy ecosystem, because our whole modern transport system is based on well-to-wheel. So you've got oil wells, and people don't really think about it much, but the energy in oil is stored sunlight from 300 million years ago. And when you build a solar farm, you cut out the 300 million years, and you've got the same kind of energy today. So we're building new solar farms as instead of oil wells. We're building new batteries instead of refineries. So you can make the energy more useful, you can refine it. We're building new electric forecourts instead of petrol forecourts and electric hubs to put that energy into electric vehicles directly. And that makes it incredibly useful. And we'll talk a bit more about it later, but we've discovered an incredible correlation between the amount of energy that people need and use for electric vehicle charging and also when solar is produced. And it's a fantastic fit, and it will only enhance the benefits and opportunities for solar over the next decade.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I like the way you phrased that there. We're sort of cutting out the middleman, if you will, and going straight from the sun to the wheel. I like that. Brilliant. Lucy, let's come to you next. What are your priorities currently, and what are the big opportunities that you see?
Well, I think, firstly, thanks very much for the invitation to be on the panel today. I think it's a great opportunity with COP just across the river behind us. You know, from a RES perspective, we've been at the forefront of the industry for 40 years, celebrating our 40th anniversary this month, which is fantastic. You know, we operate over 7 gigawatts of projects across the globe, and we're active in 10 countries. So I think that really helps us, certainly from a UK&I context, in terms of we can see innovation across different countries and we can apply that into our business model. We are a business that works from, you know, right from the inception of finding a site through the operation, construction, and into the support services of the projects. I think for us, it's, you know, we feel very much that we're at the cusp of an opportunity. We're at the growth phase again. We've got a large development portfolio. We've got a large portfolio of projects that we're operating as well. And we really want, I think what we want to see is policy certainty from government, that we can then build down into, you know, the more local level where we're developing projects and working with the communities that host our projects. So I think that's a challenge but an opportunity, and we've got to seize those and really build for the future. I think we can absolutely help to deliver net zero. I think solar has a huge role to do in that. I think that if you think our 50% of our land in UK is for agricultural use, but actually in terms of total land area, to get to our 40 gigawatts, I think we only need 0.2 of that land. You know, so anybody that says we can't do it from a land perspective is wrong. I think we really can build on that opportunity, and I'd like to see us do that as an industry.
Yeah, brilliant. Couldn't agree more. I think the land point is something we'll definitely come back onto, or maybe Ross will touch on momentarily, because I think there's also, you know, loads of opportunities for sort of synergy with not only renewable energy but nature enhancement going hand in hand. So yeah, on that note, over to you, Ross.
Thanks. Nice to be here today. So I think taking your kind of primary question as well. So Next Energy is an investment manager focused in the renewable space. We've spent the last decade building a significant business and significant portfolio of assets across the UK and international spaces. We've been a very early mover into post-subsidy solar, and we intend and believe there is a significant growth wave to come in that space. So our kind of key focus, to answer that question at the moment, is ensuring we mobilise the mountains of capital we need to attack the next decade, and that's really where we've spent a lot of the last 12, 18 months in our business, alongside developing out a significant pipeline to service that as well. One of the key challenges that we've seen to date, of course, is ensuring kind of dual use of solar, so we can combat any arguments around solar taking land entirely out of the agricultural cycle. We've also, as a business and as an industry, done a great job of deploying biodiversity measures across assets. We see significant opportunity to do more of that in the future, but we also see challenges in that as well. So as we continue to drive the levelised cost of energy of solar down, we obviously have to consider the additional costs of those biodiversity measures in the overall picture of solar, and that's not necessarily comparative with other technologies that are doing the same exercise to drive LCOE down. So we're going to be asking government to ensure that we kind of deconflict a number of those challenging areas over time, to ensure we can not only achieve those net zero ambitions, but also promote biodiversity and promote the kind of dual use of those sites over time.
Brilliant. Yeah, definitely. I think we'll want to drill down on that deconflicting, how we can deconflict a bit when we come onto it. So yeah, I think coming to you next, Sam, one of the themes I think that's been emerging from COP thus far is that net zero is not going to happen on its own. We are delivering net zero, right? And a big part of that is bringing everyone along the journey with us. So obviously, as we're building out these projects, the views of the local community are hugely important here. And I know your firm has done a bunch of polling on infrastructure projects, and most recently specifically on ground mount PV projects, which I think may well be the first of its kind polling that's been done on a significant scale. So in that context, let me hand over to you then to give us a bit more about sort of where the public is on net zero and on solar in particular.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Cam. And yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here. As you introduced, Sam Cranston with Copper Consultancy, and we specialise in communications, consultation, engagement for major and complex infrastructure projects. So we work across energy, across transport, and the built environment. On energy, we work across solar, wind, nuclear, hydrogen, hydro, transmission, and distribution and storage. As well as sort of the day job, as you mentioned there, Cam, we do look to understand what the wider perceptions of the public are towards infrastructure. We've been doing this since 2015, and since then sort of drilling down into various sort of different aspects of infrastructure and trying to understand what people's views are. So just yesterday we released public attitudes to net zero, so time to coincide with COP this week. And as you mentioned, we've just been working with Solar Energy UK on what we think, and we're definitely going to claim is the first of its kind in terms of a wider look at what public perceptions to solar are. So I'm just going to sort of drill down. This is sort of hot off the press, so I've got sort of a few notes and stats sort of just to cover off some of the key points that came out of those findings. So as you mentioned, Cam, I think the purpose of the research was to go beyond sort of some of the usual tracker data that we see that usually shows that solar is very popular amongst the public as a form of renewable energy, but to dig a bit deeper and sort of understand what are the key issues and drivers for people's perceptions. What we also wanted to do with this research is understand how people's perceptions change over time, and how usually we go from sort of project to project instead of looking actually how do people then view a project in their vicinity once it's been there for a number of years. So I'll kick off with that finding, because I think these are some of the most interesting finding from the research. So we found that local support for solar is very strong, with sort of 56% support, 25% oppose solar in their local area. The key bit was very interesting was that, as I say, support does become stronger over time. Not a huge amount, but in terms of 17% more supportive, only 2% are more opposed to solar once it's in their vicinity, once it's in their local area, once they get used to it. 66% had no change of opinion. Drilling down a bit further into sort of the demographic detail, it was 55 and overs who had the biggest change to support solar over the course of time, which we found to be quite interesting. The public also supports prioritisation of solar in national policy, and I know that's something that Solar Energy UK has been pushing for a long time. Over 2/3 support that for solar to be prioritised nationally. One of the other key findings that we found was that there is a lack of awareness around the perceived impacts and benefits, which can sort of enable misunderstanding of what those benefits can be, and a misunderstanding of actually what the impacts are or aren't of solar, and that in itself can lead to opposition. So I think all of those sort of figures combined lead us to say, and this we pulled this out of our net zero research that we published yesterday as well, that there's a job to do to explain it better, to explain to people what are the benefits, and what are the impacts, and have an honest conversation with people about what they are. People want government, want industry to be bolder in terms of how we go about delivering net zero, and I think it's for industry and us to work together to make sure we're explaining that to the public as we move forward. So there's some other findings which we can pull out as we go, and the report itself we're looking to publish this month.
Brilliant, thanks, Sam. It's really interesting stuff. I think there's a lot to unpack there. So I think one of the key takeaways to my mind was just that everybody wants both government and industry to be bolder, which is really interesting, and also that people are overwhelmingly saying solar needs to be prioritized as far as planning. But I think that, as is always the case, we can go further. So, Toddington, coming back to you, I think there's a lot more that the government can do to sort of join up the dots on the various policies that we're seeing coming out around decarbonization. There's a lot more runway, I think, for solar to really be embedded in the discussion around decarbonization of not just the electricity grids, but everything else that we do, heating our homes and transport. So can you just touch, a bit more on sort of what more you want to see from government on that front to really build the linkages that we need for solar to be part of a larger system?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure that the government have appreciated in the UK just quite how much of an important role solar has to play. Because I think people think that the UK might not be the sunniest country in the world, but it is quite windy. There's kind of probably more of an emphasis on wind. But in reality, we need both. And what the government clearly has really focused on is a need to switch to electric vehicles. But where's the energy going to come from? And so we, at GridServe, we now run the electric vehicle chargers on 85% of the motorway network, as well as building new electric forecourts. We've got pretty good representation of when people charge, how much energy they use, and the time of day. And what we've noticed, rather to our amazement, is that there's an almost precise correlation in the curve for demand for charging and solar production. And so when people kind of bring those together, it's really clear that if you combine both, real enthusiasm from the government, for support for getting people into electric vehicles as quickly as possible, with actually where's that energy going to come from, then actually what solar can do, if you bring the two together, is it can really cushion the impact of electric vehicles. I think that's really, really important. What it can also do is reduce the cost. Because what we need to do, and why we're all ultimately here at COP26, is that we've got a decade, haven't we? In fact, we haven't really got a decade. We've got today. We've got to fix this within a decade. But it basically means we've run out of time, and we have to fix it now. And I've been building sustainable energy businesses for almost 20 years, and I've realized that people just generally won't do things. The masses won't do things if they're either too expensive or they're too difficult. And the wonderful thing about solar is, it's not too difficult. People like us can deliver it at real scale. It's now, an inexpensive solution. And when you combine it with electric vehicles in particular, then you can make electric vehicles cheaper to use as well. So, it's actually combining these other solutions. The other thing that we realize is that when you combine with batteries, you can also help provide grid services. So we built the first really large, non-subsidized hybrid solar farms in the UK, and they've got dual business models. So in the day you're making energy, at night you're shifting wind, for example. So there's a combination of different things, and that's really important. And I think the final, well, maybe not final, but the other really big thing is this biodiversity piece. So I'm just over 40, and we've presided over the biggest impact to climate that's ever kind of happened. But in the last 50 years, humans have managed to wipe out over 60% of the world's wildlife. That's just, what a situation. And the fantastic thing about solar projects is that, if you combine the different pieces together, you can actually use these projects as a sanctuary to protect species. Because it's on our watch. It's on our watch for both address climate and also to protect species. The next part of my life, our life, many people watching, is going to determine how well we address those. And I don't think there's ever been, a situation that's kind of more important, has been placed on the shoulders of us now to deliver than the one that we're currently facing. And in my opinion, solar has an absolutely key role to play in that. And because it is low cost and it's easy, I have real confidence.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Maybe add a couple of bits to that.
Yeah, please do.
So I agree with everything. I think what's interesting from my perspective is over the last decade, the conversation around solar has really changed. So we were fighting for an angle just for a conversation around solar a decade ago. Now it's proven really kind of straightforward to deploy, well understood development construction process, tried and tested technology that's got really low inter-year variability from an irradiance and a performance perspective, and it's basically cemented itself as a fundamental part of the energy mix. And that's a great springboard for achieving all the stuff that you've just spoken about in the next wave of solar. So I think now more than ever, we have that opportunity to do stuff rapidly in a way that I've not seen before, and opening up to a kind of post-subsidy world. Obviously, we've got some CFDs on the horizon in solar, which will deliver some capacity. What we want to see as a business is a kind of a twin track. So we want to see CFDs delivered, but we also want to see a significant wave of investors coming into a subsidy-free model and promoting that incremental wave of growth of opportunity that is there associated with that as well. And absolutely support the biodiversity messaging as well. I mean, we can absolutely create biodiversity protected hubs that provide ecosystem services to the communities we operate in like no other business can. There are no other plots of land, to my knowledge, that are really fenced off and left alone with controlled traffic for 40 plus years. So we have a really unique opportunity. We have to ensure that we don't trip over any of those kind of trip hazards we've alluded to already in ensuring we deliver that kind of dual use over time as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, absolutely agree. I think that's a good way to sort of to frame it as well. Is we've got the springboard. We now need to really accelerate forward. So. So Lucy, I know we were talking about this earlier, but you mentioned at the top sort of needing that clarity, that regulatory clarity from government. So where are the opportunities? Where do we need further clarity that will really help the sector to move at the pace we need to move over the next decade?
I think, yeah, it's about, I suppose we term it as wholesome system thinking. We need to look at national policy, how that comes down into local policy. Those need to join up. We need a roadmap really, for delivery for net zero that's really clear, that allows the communities that are hosting, our projects to see where we're going, the steps that need to be taken, and the speed that needs to happen. I think we need to look at, how the grid keeps pace with all of that, and our planning system is streamlined to allow the projects to come through. So I suppose, government and our councils are all separated into different departments. All of those need to come together to think about how we deliver into the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the other side of that message from me as well is pretty similar. Is the industry, from my perspective, has only ever asked for one thing, and that's stability. So it's pretty resilient, pretty flexible business, solar. It's always found a way to deal with feed-in tariff and ROC cuts. It's finding a way to deliver in a post-subsidy world. But now more than ever, it needs developers to work with financiers to ensure we've got real understanding of what is coming down the road in terms of that development pipeline. We need to then be able to communicate that into the supply chain in order to get the price points where they need to be, and the quality and the components where they need to be when they need to be to deliver. And all of this needs to be tied together to educating investors to come into albeit a new space for the kind of the subsidy-free world as well, and educating them on the journey about how reliable that technology set is and what opportunities ahead of us. So yeah, stability I think is the key message the industry is asking for.
Yeah, just picking up a couple of those points as well, and particularly on the biodiversity, I think what we picked out from the research was that people are still very unaware of the biodiversity benefits that solar can offer. So we as an industry understand what they do offer, but there's still a job to do, I think, on a national level and then a project-specific level to really communicate what those benefits are. Similarly, on planning, people see that as one of the biggest barriers still to. So I think that's probably shared amongst industry and the public as to what the biggest barriers are to getting or bringing forward more solar at pace is planning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think. Sorry, did you want to come in?
I was just going to say, I think added to biodiversity, and again, we talked about it before the session. I think one of the really important, and probably an area that we haven't, as an industry, done enough about or talked enough about is, in where the projects are. There's highly skilled jobs associated with those. They bring rates into the local councils. That's an area where we're helping sustain families who want to continue to live in the areas they've grown up. And for me, that's really important and a really positive message that we can bring.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, we obviously all want and strive our best to be responsible developers, to bring communities along the journey with us. It's not just sort of parachuting in, building a bunch of kit and shipping power out to somebody else. It's really part of the community. I think going forwards, there's a lot that we can do collectively to embed that message further. I mean, Sam, just coming back to you, I mean, could you drill down a bit more on sort of what came out of the research as far as what communities are specifically looking for from these projects?
I think what they're sort of looking for and what the research tells us is just clarity on what those benefits are. I think there's still, as I mentioned before, a real misunderstanding of what actually comes as part of the package, and we've talked about some of those already today. But it's not just a bunch of panels sitting in the middle of a field. There's a lot that goes around that. And one of the interesting things we pulled out of this and from the net zero research is that people see other people as a big barrier to bringing forward plans, and so there's obviously some scepticism in there as well. But yeah, people see that they want to keep the environmental impacts down, and I think there's still, again, a job to do in explaining the environmental benefits, but also that potentially the environmental impacts that people perceive aren't as great as they may think. Jobs, skills is a big one as well, and want to see what the local benefits are. And many of these communities are hosting, as you mentioned, these projects, and it might be solar, it might be other infrastructure or renewable energy projects, but they're being hosted in particular communities, and people want to see a benefit of that, whether that is jobs or investment into local economy as well.
Just another point on the biodiversity piece. I mean, some of the most exciting kind of projects that we've done has actually been once we've built projects and we've got biodiversity net gain to kind of engage with local community. So we've welcomed schools in. Obviously, you need to do it carefully. We've had kids, come along to help plant seed banks, to kind of measure and monitor the amount of butterflies and different creatures that are kind of been available. We use it as an opportunity to get people from the RSPB along to teach, show like wildlife and explain what hibernaculars are and hedgehogs and all this sort of stuff. And and the kids left with a real buzz. And I'm pretty certain that they'll retain that. And those people will absolutely be who it was a number of years ago we first started doing this, and then grown up to be supportive parents and hopefully ambassadors, and now do some of this as well. So I think it's just really important to be able to kind of connect people together, and people to then really understand. I think the other thing is about nature. I mean, people inherently understand that we need to eat, and that pollinators is important. And there's a real problem. Our bees, for example, particularly due to some of the pesticides and fertilizers, are in a real crisis. And actually, this is an opportunity to protect pollinators. And when people like bees, but they don't necessarily the same people like solar farms. And when you bring the two together, and actually now we're doing some pretty cool stuff, because whilst I said solar is easy, it is the core technology is really straightforward. But what we're now doing is we're now developing additional solutions that are really on the forefront. So we're putting in, we're the first company to install large solar farms with trackers that kind of evenly spread out the generation throughout the day. We're using bifacial panels that can generate energy and harvest on both sides. We're now putting in DC coupled systems. We're putting in optimizers. We're putting in a lot of different things. But the thing that made me think about that is one of the other things that we're also experimenting on is what type of pollinating plants that we can put in that have got the highest albedo, which means reflectance test. Because if you've got solar panels called bifacial that generate energy on both sides, if you can put pollinating plants that actually reflect more light, then you can create a business case, if it works, and this is what we're trying to work out, for actually putting in more of those pollinating plants. And that business case then leads to potentially vast arrays of areas which are just perfect for pollinators. So there's a combination of different things that you can do.
We've got some notes to share with you about harvesting chamomile from between the rows.
Okay, excellent.
Bright white flower through the peak generation seasons. We're running the same case study. It's quite interesting. I think there's a call to arms there, though, right? I mean, we've been speaking about biodiversity for a long time in the industry. We've done some really cool stuff. What we've never done is join the thinking up. So we have pockets of really cool intelligence that you guys have got the same. The industry needs to make sure that that's widely available to you guys in the centre to pull it all together so we can market it back to the wider population.
Absolutely, and I think I'm really pleased actually how much biodiversity is coming out of this conversation, because we are doing a ton of work on it, and forthcoming over the next year are going to be doing annual biodiversity surveys across, a really good sample of ground mount solar farms, and we've been working with a bunch of ecologists across the country to put together sort of a standard methodology for assessment. So you can go in, ideally a one-day turnaround, go in, get all the data you need, join it up so that you're comparing like with like from season to season, and we'll be able to see in much more detail over time what the benefits really are from all these parks. So I think it's a really good example right there of sort of where we need more joined up thinking, not just about the climate crisis, not just about decarbonizing our energy systems, but also how we can be sort of, how solar in particular can play that dual role of addressing climate change and the biodiversity crisis at the same time. Now there have been loads of changes recently. I think I'm sure every one of us has read all 1,700 pages of documents that were dropped a couple of weeks ago. The net zero strategy, the budget, the heat and building strategy, and so on. And we've spoken a lot about biodiversity, but I think one thing that we haven't touched on as much is perhaps planning, and perhaps where there are some missed opportunities in the recent net zero strategy, or in the budget where where the government could really go further to help spur on solar development more rapidly. So I guess a question for everyone really: what would you like to see more of, or what are the sorts of forthcoming policy changes that you're really looking to see from government to unlock that next wave of new projects, or that next level of speed in terms of rollout?
Do you want me to go first? So look, I think it's quite easy to be pessimistic around COP and around what's been published. I think optimism is a key part of us achieving the next decade. So having a plan is a great step. Right? I mean, we've been crying out for more clarity, more plans over the last year. So actually having something that we can now kind of look and drive towards is a great step forward. So I think very optimistic off the back of that. We obviously need to deliver on the clarity around things like the planning legislation, around the AC/DC split, around the NSIP and the local determination schemes. That's a key part of unlocking additional capacity in the existing development pipeline. Could be kind of 20-30% or more in some projects, depending on how land constrained they are. So that's kind of a key thing we're looking at over the intermediate period. Again, talking about stability, we really need to ensure good, viable projects have clean access to the grid. So over time, that whole kind of ecosystem thinking that you've mentioned already, Lucy, is around ensuring that we're able to really kind of develop out the most viable projects. And I think kind of missing pieces of the jigsaw from my perspective are really driving consumer change towards electrification where it's viable. So continued adoption of EV, continued electrification of heat where it's viable. All of that feeds into the kind of expected demand curves. That has an impact on those long-term energy forecasts that boring institutional investors like us worry about, because we've got a 40-year asset life, and a lot of our life is about understanding how those curves evolve. So we really need government to be very ambitious and very clear about what it expects from solar over the next decade, because it has an impact on the forecasters' belief around whether we're going to achieve net zero or not. That has an impact on their expectations of forward power price and demand, and that kind of does a big circle back to whether projects are ultimately deployable or not. So from my perspective, it's a bit more clarity, it's a bit more ambition.
Yeah, brilliant. Targeting or Lucy, anything to add there?
From my perspective, just coming from a macro perspective, a macro big picture, I think what the government are doing is absolutely brilliant. I think it's absolutely fabulous. It was quite murky a few years ago when you were trying to work out, we're going to need to reduce emissions by X%, by such and such a date, excluding shipping, excluding, it was all kind of like, what does any of that mean? And then, I believe it was Theresa May that, just removed all the ambiguity and said, right, we're going to net zero, and we're going there as quick as we possibly can, and a long stop date of 2050. And it feels that since that point, everything else has been getting around that position, and all these new policy statements have been coming out. And it feels fantastic. I mean, in the solar days, we were kind of almost a bit like fighting the government, because the subsidies were permanently changing, and business was in chaos, and it was all this kind of change. It was a real battle, and You know, it's just kind of great to be working together, I think, you know, because, you know, we're all in it together. You know, the wider policy frameworks are now, you know, really pushing things forward. And, you know, from our perspective, when we're putting in planning applications, there's just an inherent kind of need from the council to, you know, councils to want to approve things, because we know we need to get to net zero. We know it's binding. You know, actually, when it comes to putting in electric vehicle charging infrastructure, there's almost a pull. You know, please put this in, which is fantastic. You know, when we're combining the two together, it's like, whoa, and this is not just net zero, this is zero carbon. So I guess just from my perspective, I mean, it's quite easy to talk about the things that government could be doing better, but I think it's also, you know, an opportunity to celebrate, you know, quite what we're doing. I mean, I think we're definitely leaders in this space. We grabbed that net zero mantle, I think, before, you know, the first of, I don't know if we were the first or certainly one of the first, and we're leading it. And I'm pretty convinced that, you know, of all the kind of net zero pledges that have been made, you know, across the river by other governments, I'm pretty sure a lot of them wouldn't have happened because of what we're doing. So personally, I think it's great. We obviously need more. We need to do more quicker. But the fact that we've got this absolutely clear target now, you know, gives us the direction, the focus, and the consistency that we need to kind of get on with the job.
Yeah, brilliant. I love the amount of optimism that coming out of this conversation. I mean, we're nothing if not optimistic as an industry.
Yeah, well, I think just sort of building on that as well. I think someone described it earlier in the week as coptimism, but I'm not so sure about that. But I think you know, sharing what the panel has said already, that, you know, having that plan is a step forward. It is positive to have a plan. It certainly, you know, you say, gave the Prime Minister a better platform to stand on, to have that plan in place when talking over the river earlier this week. So obviously the devil is very much in the detail with these things, and you know, the action from what comes out of the strategy and indeed the action that comes out of COP over the next weeks, months and years will be important. But yeah, absolutely, it's very positive to see that progress being made and to have those plans and strategies in place to be able to build on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, one of the things obviously coming out of this conversation as well is just that clarity, that certainty. You know, we've got those targets, you know, that gives us the confidence. So I think, and at the end of the day, it's all about how do we, you know, mobilize more private equity, private capital faster to really get these things out the door. So I guess, Lucy, you know, your sort of, what are you seeing in terms of sort of investor perceptions of the UK market now that we've got sort of these frameworks in place?
I think that the market's definitely building. I think just going back, the government's really important, but actually the agility within the industry itself. You know, we will, I think, continue to work on and develop and keep going. We obviously ask for policy certainty, but I think then, you know, the building from the companies developing and investing, you know, that will just help create more investment opportunities. I think it's a really exciting time to be in the industry. I've worked sort of on the onshore wind, solar and energy storage. I think what's really important also that investors will want to see combined renewables, whether that's co-location, hybrid. We've got to innovate as well to bring the investors. And the investors, just back really to what Ross said, they want certainty. They want certainty. They want to see plans, and they want to know what's coming from government to allow them to make those investment decisions. Otherwise, they'll just go to other countries, I think.
That's right. It is a global marketplace, isn't it, for solar? We're seeing loads of it deployed everywhere. That's a really good point. We want to make sure that our market is as attractive as possible, you know, vis-a-vis everywhere else you could go with your money. But I think that's a really good point about sort of, you know, we don't just want to stop at PV, right? There's so many other things that you can do, that you can, you know, bolt onto these projects to make them, you know, do really interesting things in terms of grid services that we touched on as well. I mean, Ross, maybe you can expand just a bit more on sort of the co-location opportunities and how we can really take solar to the next level with sort of additionality in terms of storage and flexibility.
Sure. So definitely an important part of the emerging picture. I think, forgive me, we recently signed a joint venture to fund around 100 million of pounds of battery in the UK. That's our kind of first really material step into the battery storage space. We've done that primarily because it's a good component of the existing portfolio we've got. We really like the way that you can generate revenue from those assets in parallel with the solar. In the future, we see the co-location of solar and battery as key as we get further out into the distance in the development program as well. So I think gone are the days when solar is kind of, you know, rinse and repeat. I think it does evolve and it does become a little bit more complex. So, you know, like what Tonington's referred to already, you know, we're already developing kind of bifacial co-located projects on the basis that really you start to think about these as a more organic energy generating station than just a kind of simple PV station that generates in the curve and pumps into the grid. So I think it will evolve over time. And the stability of solar, and I use that word a lot, but that kind of underlying understanding of PV that investors have got, and that underlying respect they have for infrastructure projects in the UK mean that actually they can cope quite well with the industry innovating and moving that bar further forward.
Just to kind of add a bit to that, you know, we think that we've definitely found that the way we were able to get the first, you know, large non-subsidised solar projects over the line was by changing it, you know, changing the perspective from, you know, a position of, you know, not so many years ago where, you know, it was, you know, you'd get paid for the energy irrespective of what happened to that energy. So there was no kind of real value applied to the energy apart from the green credentials of it, to turning that on its head and saying, how do we make this more useful? You know, we lost, you know, a significant amount of the revenue stack from the subsidy. So how do we make up for that in making that energy more useful? And that's what we get when we combine it with a combination of other solutions. You know, being able to shift energy from times when it's, you know, when it's low value into high value is pretty obvious. As we head towards net zero, you know, we have to make net zero work. That's why we're called grid serve, because, you know, if we keep just adding solutions which impact the grid and don't fix them, then we're not going to get there. We're just not going to get there. The grid won't work for it. And so our kind of view is we need to serve the grid, and we can do that by providing additional value. And that value is obtained by combining a combination of different solutions. And actually we could harness value from those pieces as well. You know, we've now got that, you know, right to the kind of extreme end of that by when I mentioned what we're doing from sun to wheel. And to give you another kind of example, so, you know, we are, you know, extracting the energy from the sun, harnessing it from the sun. We're putting it into, you know, we're making it more useful in batteries. We're then putting it into electric vehicles, and we're actually also leasing electric vehicles. And what we've also done is we've worked out that, you know, we need to plant more trees. And again, it's not easy to plant trees. And so every vehicle somebody leases to us, we've got an agreement in place with a company that plants 100 trees. Yeah, and all of that is paid for by sunshine. Yeah, so we've created the world's most elaborate tree planting machine. But, you know, it's kind of all important that if you add all the different pieces of the jigsaw together and you create something that's inherently more valuable, we think that's that's why solar will stack up, and that's what helps with investors, because you're not just kind of, it used to be this curve, wasn't it? This various different curve, and, you know, no one really believed those curves because no one had a perfect crystal ball. But that was what the investment was made under. Whereas the future is all about the inherent value of using this technology to get us to and beyond, hopefully, net zero. And you get that from combining different solutions.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, it's really interesting to hear that sort of the journey that investors have gone on with solar over time. I think is, you know, as you touched on, Ross, the predictability of solar, I think, is really one of its strengths. You know, people often talk about variable renewables as being a challenge in and of themselves, but, you know, interseasonally, you know, the sun's not changing its patterns, right? We know exactly what those generation curves are going to look like. We know exactly what, you know, we can do with the energy when demand changes, how we can you know, triage and you know, serve the grid, as you say. So on that note, I think we're about at the end of our time for this session. I just wanted to say thank you again to everyone on the panel today for joining us. Thanks for a really interesting discussion. Thank you to everyone in the studio and online for joining us today. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your time at COP or viewing COP remotely.
Welcome back, and I'm delighted, as we said earlier, to welcome Lord Deben, who is chair of the Climate Change Committee in the UK, and really one of the longest-standing members of the climate change advocacy community. He's been talking and campaigning on these issues for pretty much his entire career, and certainly as long as I've known him. So it's delighted to have you here. Lord Deben will say a few words first of all, and then we'll have a few questions from myself, and then we'll pause for the final panel, which will be about the rooftop sector.
Good. Well, thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here. I'm sorry that these protests, I have this very curious view, which I think most people do have, which is that you're very much in favour of why they're doing it, but not just now in front of you when you're driving your motor car or being driven, which is what happened to me here, getting here today. But what I wanted to say was a little bit about how the Climate Change Committee is looking at this whole programme, and particularly how solar fits into that. First of all, it's extremely good that the government has not only got Parliament to accept the 6th carbon budget, because that then gives us a proper route to 2050, because if we haven't got where we have to get by the end of the 2030s, we're not going to get it. So it's very clear. You only have to join the end up with 2050 to know where we're going to be. So the 6th carbon budget was absolutely crucial. And then to take the next step, which was to say that by 2035 there would be no more fossil fuel generation, was a very, very crucial bit to doing that. And then indeed to produce the heat and buildings report as well as the net zero strategy before COP26. COP26 has been very useful, of course, because governments always want to take a bit more time to think about this, that and the other, and when you can't do that any longer, it actually gets what you want at the time. And I was pleased to listen to the panel, actually. I was pleased it went that way round, because one of the things that I thought came out of the panel was that there's a good deal of optimism about what this now means. I mean, one of the problems with green campaigners is they find it frightfully difficult to say thank you for anything. I mean, all that they seem to do is to want the next bit. Well, I understand that, but if we were all decently brought up, what we always said was thank you first of all, and then you got the next birthday present, didn't you? But if you didn't say thank you, you didn't get a present next time. And I think there's a certain thing about that, about the way in which we've been handling this up to now. So I was very pleased to hear from the panel that there was a real feeling of optimism, that people felt that they were on the way, that there were steps and the government was dealing reasonably with it. And of course, the next step is hugely important, because this is what one might call the action bit. And my job for the next year, up to the end of my session as chairman of the Climate Change Committee, will be, of course, to keep the government's feet to the fire in order to make sure that it actually does the things that you have to do all the time to make these strategies into a daily, weekly, monthly, annual activity, because that is indeed what it has to be. But at least we've got a programme. And I was thinking, as a businessman all my life, except when I was a minister, as a businessman, I know very well that the most important thing in life is to accept that uncertainty is general, that you don't know what's going to happen, but to grab onto any certainties that are around, because at least that gives you a chance to get some things right. And we do now have certain certainties. We know perfectly well that the climate change issue has been taken on board, even by those governments who are least good at dealing with it, that there is no question now that that is the direction that we are moving. And that's what Paris established. But it seems to me that that has become stronger and stronger as the time has gone on. And that's partly because of the reality of climate change, which has hit everybody everywhere. And that's why I think that one can see this as a reality and a continuity, because climate change is going to get worse. It's quite difficult to explain to people that even if you do everything that we should be doing, it's not going to get any better until we've kind of worked out this bit, which of course is largely our fault. It's the British, not least the Scots, and the Industrial Revolution. And that's what's actually doing it at the moment. And that's one of the reasons why when you get the sort of person in the audience who says, well, should we do anything about it? And I say, well, because first of all, you're living off the riches. That is what we're doing. And therefore, we do have to pay for it in terms of getting developing countries able to move from where they are to where they ought to be, and they're going to have to do that, and we've benefited from the pollution that we've made, and we've therefore created the circumstances in which we cannot have them polluting in the same way. So if we want them to behave in a way which will save the world for all of us, then that's up to us, and that's the bill, which is why the government was so disgraceful in cutting overseas aid from 0.7 to 0.5. It was not only immoral, you don't kick people who are worse off than you are when you're in a bad position. That's the very moment in which you try to support them. But it's also stupid, because it's going to be much more difficult during this conference to get people to believe that we really are going to fund it if you've already, I think, quite dishonestly gone back on your election manifesto pledges and done things. And there's another bit to it which makes it particularly bad, which is that, of course, a very large amount of the money that has been cut is the money which goes for women's education. And if you think about what we have to do in the world as a whole as far as climate change is concerned, the establishment of women with an independence and ability is not just a question of dealing with the ever-increasing population, which is absolutely, it's much more important to do that than to hand out condoms. I mean, what really matters is getting women able to make their own decisions. But also, it happens to be true, and I know this because my business, Sandcroft, we've been working with Coca-Cola for the last 20 years. And if you talk to them, I mean, the reason they have been interested in the emancipation of women is because they actually get the women to run the finances, because they know perfectly well in the many countries that is exactly what you have to do. But you can't do that unless you recognise that women's education is so crucial. Now, I only bring that into discussion about solar because I think sometimes there is a problem in the energy industry, which is that people get so keen on the particular way in which they are helping to solve the problems that they tend to not see the bigger picture. And I always want to say it's not a question of either or, it's a question of both and both and is actually working within this global situation. And of course, it's not only the industry, it's rather like government. I mean, government has this huge problem of being siloed. And when Bayes produces this very good document, I say very good because it was largely all the things that we said in the Climate Change Committee, so it was obviously very good. But if you look at the gaps, they're the bits they're not really responsible for. So land use, for example, which is hugely important as far as solar is concerned, is consigned to a few paragraphs. Where that's because DEFRA is supposed to be doing that, and DEFRA hasn't done it. I mean, the DEFRA is in no state at all, it seems to me, to be delivering the same quality of stuff which we actually have to do. So if I were to say now what the things I think we are looking for as far as the solar industry is concerned, first of all, start with land use, because until we have some really sensible policy about how we're going to use the land of Britain, we're not going to be able to take the proper steps as far as solar is concerned. That's number one. Number two is you don't get that unless you have a proper planning system. And the difficulty is we have a planning system which hasn't been brought up to date, and therefore doesn't include anything about net zero. So nobody has to take any notice of the fact that the government has signed the Paris Agreement, that the government has committed itself statutorily to reach net zero, that the government has actually made 6 carbon budgets legally binding, but there's nothing about that in the present planning system. And so that is what Michael Gove's going to have to do. I mean, we've got to have a planning system which makes it possible. And I think the best example of this is this ridiculous concept of building a coal mine in Cumbria. Now, it's ridiculous because they should never have got to this stage without somebody telling the Australians who are doing it, you do realise that after 2035 you're not going to be able to use coal in the way you think. So So giving you planning permission, as they originally did, till 2045 was in fact dishonest, because 10 years of that weren't going to happen anyway. But when you look at it, you find the Cumbrian County Council had no recommendation of that at all, because it had no advice of that. There was nothing in the planning system. There was no way they could take that into account. And what's worse is that the department that ought to have been helping them, which was the Department of Local Government, and now Levelling Up, or whatever it calls itself, that department has no central system of advising people on climate change. It doesn't even have advice for its own business, so it can't even advise itself on the subject. And so you really do see some of the problems that we've actually got to break through. They're institutional problems, and they're not because people are wicked. I mean, when you know, I'm not George Monbiot. I mean, it's not because they're wicked. It is simply because we have a structure that hasn't caught up with what needs to be caught up, and that's going to be more difficult than many things, because as we all know, that structural change is particularly difficult. Which then comes to the third thing, which is that if you get the planning system right and you make sensible decisions about that, then you've also got to make sure that you've got the electricity system itself right. And I do find the way that the government looks at this is still too marginal. It still doesn't understand that there's a systemic change. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to talk to senior people and explain the simple matter, which is that it's best thought through the French, actually, because they used to call they do call their generating stations, as you know, centrales. And that really explains how the system works. You had a centrale and it shoved stuff out. Now we don't have a centrale shoving stuff out, we have a lot of pieces shoving stuff in. And that does, in fact, I know it's not very scientific, but then I'm not a scientist, which makes it very easy for me, because I ask the most difficult questions. If you're not a scientist, people have to explain to you in a way that you can then explain to Mrs. Miggins, which is an important part of this. So you say to them, well, if that is a totally different sort of system, and we're not thinking about it sufficiently like that, and we have to. And the best example, of course, it is the ludicrous situation of offshore wind, where we've got all these arrays out, and we've still got a system which is designed to increase competition, which means that every array has got to link in to onshore separately, because it's not allowed to have some kind of common system. No sane person would run the electricity system like that, and it's not surprising that all the way around the coast of East Anglia, and I come from East Anglia, so I have an interest in this, all the way around the coast, I mean, the very villages that were most supportive about offshore wind and terribly keen on renewables and very interested in doing something about climate change are now absolutely all up in arms, because people are building great things in the middle of their village because there isn't a ring main, because nobody's worked out how you do this thing properly. And it is like Dad's Army, it just isn't a sensible mechanism. The last thing I want to really say about that then is to come to your industry itself. And I'm a great fan, and I think there's a huge amount that's being done, and it's a crucially important part of the mix that we have to have. And now we know how much we have to have in order to make the changes that we have now put into law. You've got a wonderful opportunity. So I want to plead with you, please, about language, because I do think it is still true that we don't talk the language that the people out there need to hear. Now, I loved the connection which you were making between the industry and biodiversity and the whole of that. So let me try to say how I think the context needs to be drawn. And the first thing is, I'm fond of quoting the Pope, because in Laudato Si, his great encyclical, had this wonderful concept that climate change is the symptom of what we've done to the world. So what we ought to be concerned about is not the symptoms, but the disease. And what we have to cure is the disease. It's the disease of pollution, it's the disease of air pollution, water pollution, it's the disease of destroying the quality of the soil, it's the disease of how we've dealt with quite a lot of people, it's the disease of modern slavery, it's the disease of all those things. But those are the things, and above all, it's the disease of losing biodiversity, of destroying biodiversity. And so what we have to do is to look at curing the disease. Because if you just think about the symptoms, no doctor's going to be any use. And getting rid of the spots doesn't cure measles. It's the measles you've got to cure, and that is what we have to. And if we're going to do that, then we have all the time to look beyond climate change to the kind of world we're building. And we're building a greener, cleaner, kinder world. That's what you do. It's by accident, in a sense, because you have to do that in order to beat climate change. But as far as people are concerned, unless you give them that vision, which is the vision of a positive future, then you get mixed up with two things. One is misery, and misery never wins. I mean, the frightening people never wins. You have to give people a hope, and that's crucial. But the second thing is, if you don't do that, you get tied up in the technicalities. And that's really what I want to plead with the industry to do, is to get better, not getting tied up with the technicalities, and using a narrative which actually reaches out to a wider variety of people. We're bound to have problems of people who don't want things in this field and don't want things round the corner and do want to have it like it always was. And I remember my grandfather used to walk and pick flowers in that field. We all know about that, but you can only overcome it not by technicalities, not by telling people, well, you know, this adds 0.56 to the national opportunities, and you'll have to make your contribution because everybody else has to. I mean, by that time she's gone. You have to get something much more important, which is to tell the story in the way, which is why I love the discussing of biodiversity and the rest of it. And those flowers, I didn't hear about the flowers before, I'm going to pick those up very well. But it's about talking about this as part of the life that people understand and live, rather than the white heat of technology. Remember, well, you won't remember because you're all too young, but Harold Wilson had this phrase, white heat technology, and it was the most disastrous phase that anybody had. He thought it was wonderful because he's terribly excited by technology. Most other people were put off hugely because the last thing they wanted was white heat technology. They much preferred where they were. And we have got to break that through by getting the language right. So I end by saying I banned the phrase kilowatt hour in climate change, because I don't think anybody knows what a kilowatt hour is. I don't know what it is, because I can't feel it, can't touch it, doesn't matter to me. That's why I talk about bills, because that means something to people. And that seems to me to be the next step, in a real sense, for the solar industry, is to get people to love it in a way which you only do if you have a better story.
That was extremely helpful and very good advice for us. Thank you. I had a question about narrative, but I won't ask that because you just answered it. But just by way of segueing into our next panel, which is around the on-site generation and rooftop markets, I wonder if you can say a little bit about where you see the role of on-site generation, solar and energy storage in sort of the cleaning up of our buildings and sort of the heating building strategy, because it sometimes does feel that that's dominated by energy efficiency and now heat pumps, and the sort of on-site generation gets a little sidelined. I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that.
Well, it's one of the funny things, isn't it? Because it's always one of them that gets sidelined. It used to be energy efficiency, because it's very boring as energy efficiency, and politicians don't like it because politicians like big things that can happen. That's why Tories particularly, I think it's sexual really, they like big nuclear power stations because they can point at it and say, I got that done, if you know what I mean. Whereas you can't do that with energy efficiency. So I always thought energy efficiency is quite difficult for politicians to talk about. And now we are talking about it a bit because people are beginning to realise that actually is quite an important thing to do. And we've got better at talking about it too, which I think is important. The difficulty with the narrative on-site, any sort of on-site generation is because people immediately think of ugliness. They immediately think of something that's going to make the site less attractive. And so we've got to find a better way of describing it so you can break down that concept. And I think we've just got to be more imaginative about it. I mean, and we've got to get rid of some of the sillinesses that there are in the system which make it difficult to do that. Indeed, I'm trying to find a way in which we could have a sort of version of the better regulation committee. In other words, a system whereby when there was something that was in the way, that was institutional, then you would have a place where you could go with it, and they would have an institutional requirement to find a way out of it. So the government would do it in that way. Surprising how they don't like it, civil servants, because it will show up quite a lot. But I had a little one the other way. It happened to me. I just declare an interest. We've got land, and it's in an agreement with for planting trees and bushes and putting back all the hedgerows, and it's been wonderful. And we've been doing it all, and it cost me a lot of money, but we have had some grant from the government. There's no easy way of saying, if you've got that sort of agreement, let's say, I'm inventing this, 100 acres, there's no easy way of saying, well, we've just discovered that if we use half an acre, we can actually start, we can do some solar power. You can't do it, because the system doesn't allow for this, because nobody thought about that when you started. So you can't kind of take a bit out, even however good the argument is. Now, that's only a very small example of the sort of things that we've got to get out of, so that you can actually think about the way in which the world is now going to work. So I think it's about beauty and about how you overcome people's instinctive belief that it's going to be really ugly and stick out and not nice. And then the other bit is, how do you get the institutional things that are out of there? Because some of that on buildings is just simply the rules and regulations, and some of the ways which local councils interpret them. Then you come back to the planning bill, which is going to have to cover that.
Thank you very much. We have to close now and move on to the next panel, but just thank you very much for your time. It should be said that Lord Deben was our first leader of our first delegation as the UK for the COP1. So he was there at the beginning. Incidentally, that was also chaired by a lesser-known German environment minister called Angela Merkel. So we have a strong heritage here in our midst. So very much thank you for your time, and good luck with the rest of the week. And
thank you.
We'll see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I think we're following on from a number of interesting sessions we've had earlier in the day with sort of an introduction from Chris, that we've had an exploration of the opportunities and the current state of play in the ground-mounted industry. And we've had Lord Deben giving us an overview of the context, looking at the wider state of play in the COP negotiations and how we can sort of envisage solar's place within that, but not losing light of the wider, I guess, discussions that need to be considered. That one of the interesting pieces at the end was, I guess, focusing on the narrative and ensuring that solar really is kind of changing the way that we're engaging with consumers, with the public, and with businesses, so that we're moving beyond a state of this being very sort of technocratic and a technological solution to being something that's an everyday part of the solution. Also, a focus on it moving beyond being ugly, which is something that Solibus, the firm that I work with, has been working on from the start, that designing sort of solar solutions that are beautiful and people want to be around. That I'm Matt Black, the chair of Solar Energy UK, and that I'm joined today by a number of panellists who are kind of leading lights and leaders in different areas of the rooftop sector, that will be exploring the current state of play, the areas for growth, and kind of diving into the different challenges that are being experienced as we start to look at different sort of subsectors within the rooftop sector that are being developed. That when we look at the rooftop sector, that it's been a success in the UK, as it's been in many parts of the world, principally down to subsidies in the growth to date, that we now have around 2 gigawatts of commercial rooftop solar and 3 gigawatts of residential solar, which means that there's solar on 1 million households across the UK. That solar has proved itself now to be a reliable, low-cost solution. The industry is mature, and that the supply chain has been kind of built up, where that throughout the past decade that there's been a significant run rate across the whole of the UK, that with solar being installed from Cornwall throughout England, Northern Ireland, Wales, and here in Scotland, that it's, I think, a technology with wide public support, but that we've often seen that, I think, that from my personal conversations, that while the ground-mounted sector has taken off and obviously has an important place to play in growing sort of the net zero, net carbon generation, that rooftop solar is something that is intuitively felt by most people as a good use of space, a good way to generate electricity, and it has the benefits of being on site. But I think that now that we can say that it's now got wide support across a number of different stakeholders, certainly in the conversations that I've been having over the past year or two, that there's been a significant uptake in investors, kind of businesses, consumers, now all sort of falling into alignment around the need to decarbonise, that the kind of announcements and the commitments around net zero seem to be biting, and that now, whenever you're having a conversation, that there seems to be sort of an implicit acceptance that this is the way that the direction of travel, the way things are moving, so that then we get into the detail of how we actually make that happen, and that moving into the challenges of going from something that's generally perceived to be a good idea, that a way to decarbonise operations, something that's going to be delivering sort of a lower cost form of energy, but that involves an amount of complexity. I think that it's also kind of a testament to the sector, the diversity of installs that we're seeing, so that now that we see sort of rooftop solar being delivered across the whole range of roofs, that from now on a merchant basis, sort of post-subsidy, that we're seeing rooftop solar being installed on homes, that both new build and retrofit across sort of businesses, that in the commercial and industrial sector, and also in the public sector, on schools and hospitals, and that we're now sort of moving towards quite a robust run rate, that despite the disruptions of COVID, that the rooftop solar sector in the UK continued to deliver new capacity despite the challenges, and that in the last quarter 97 megawatts was delivered, which is sort of shows the state of growth. On the panel today, that we're going to be exploring a number of issues, looking at the opportunities for the rooftop solar sector, seeing that how it can help to deliver on a number of the government policy initiatives that have been announced sort of in quick succession over the past couple of weeks, along with the kind of the wider commitments to net zero. Also kind of specifically around enabling the decarbonisation of heat and transport, where I think that solar can play a significant role being on site. And finally around the kind of the movement towards making solar standard on new buildings. But that with that, there kind of do remain a number of challenges that we can talk through around grid and regulation. Supply chain issues continue to be something that are being worked through, and that if we're looking to deliver what we need to deliver, that there's going to be a need for more skilled workforce to be able to meet that. That in previous sessions this afternoon, that we've heard about the need to be able to deliver significant growth in solar alongside all of the other clean energy technologies over the next decade. That as an industry we've made a commitment to treble the amount of solar on the grid over the next decade, which we'll see in 2030 us getting to 40 gigawatts of solar. But that requires swift action and a constant run rate over that decade. On the panel here today, that I've got three gentlemen, as I said, that John Roper, who is Principal Renewable Energy Engineer at Evo Energy, who comes with kind of deep experience in the commercial sector. That we've got John Southern, who's the Head of Product Development and Strategy at HBS New Energies, one of the leading companies focused on the new build sector. And then we've got Jason Howlett, who's Managing Director of CGen, the UK's leading distributor of PV, energy storage and EV solutions. So I think that with that diversity of experiences, it'll be interesting to dive into some of the challenges that we see and the opportunities for the sector. If I was to hand over, John, first to yourself to, I guess, run through the current state of play and how you're seeing the growth of the sector at the moment.
Oh, thank you, Matt. It's a really exciting time in solar at the moment. We, for the first time last year, Evo Energy were able to put a 5-year business plan together that we then had to tear up as COVID hit. We're seeing real organic growth in the sector with post-subsidy. We're relying on solar paying for itself with the bottom line of saving people money on their energy bills. Saving people carbon, and in the commercial rooftop sector, obviously we're filling up people's roofs. We're using space that is essentially wasted space that no one's ever thought of putting stuff on there before. We're not taking up lands, we're not taking up fields, and when we go and talk to customers today, they're not looking like at the old ways of doing things, like with BREEAM, what's the minimum amount of solar we can get on to make that building hit an A+ or whatever. No one thinks about that anymore. What they're thinking about is real. What is our total energy use in this building? What is our factory processes? What do we use in a year? What can we use to offset the electricity here? And if our roofs ain't big enough, what about the car park? Why can't we fill up the car park with solar carports? Evo Energy are also, we're Evo Energy, we're evolution of energy. That's why we called ourselves Evo Energy. And we're not just only looking at solar, we're looking at batteries, we're looking at supporting the grid through grid services. We're looking at using batteries to peak shave on grid connections, so you don't need a bigger cable going into your factory anymore. You can use solar combined with batteries and actually save on money connecting your factory up. Also, we're supporting in much more conjoined, multi-technology, multifaceted solutions. We've opened up the UK's first solar-powered park and ride last month in Leeds in the summer, where you can park up your electric vehicle, plug it in, it charges off solar PV. You can go to the terminal, buy your ticket, get on an electric bus that's powered by solar and catch the bus into Leeds City Centre. These are the types of projects that people are now thinking about in the whole. It's not just a single solution, solar solution anymore. What people are looking at is how to offset carbon in and around, and solar is a really easy solution to do, because you know that every bit of juice that comes off a solar PV system, Lord Devon said I'm not allowed to use a kilowatt hour anymore, so juice, it either goes into the factory or goes into the grid, and that's a real easy, simple thing to tell people, and that's how businesses are looking at things now. And I don't know, these gentlemen will also probably say the phone's been off the hook. We've seen real organic growth in the industry now, and what we're looking at and where people are going now is looking at not only owning their own solar, but also owning their own distribution systems and smart grids. You've got large blue chip companies who have got the problem of electrifying their fleets, and that's where solar, battery, EV, and who knows what's happening with hydrogen and things in the future. That's all coming together in one picture, and that's where Evo Energy is evolving energy for the future.
Fantastic. No, thanks for that. And I think that it's really fascinating to hear now about that evolution towards those integrated solutions. And often it's been sort of spoken about the use of batteries, but I think that now that on more and more regular basis that we're seeing these being kind of twinned with those solutions.
Yeah, I mean, a battery is like a Swiss Army knife. You've got it, and you can use it in so many ways. You've got your weird squirrely thing that you pull out from stones from your horse's hooves, and you've got grid services. You've got you can use it straight for solar load shifting. You can use it for peak shaving, so you don't have to have as a robust distribution grid. Equally, you can use it to cascade electric vehicle chargers, so you can have EV chargers charging through the night on your fleet. There are so many different ways you can use a battery, and I think we're only just scraping the surface of those things. Obviously, the financiers and those people who are looking for robust investment cases are looking at grid services and regular incomes, but once you combine batteries on-site locations, you've got so many more things that you can do that aren't just supporting the grid. Obviously, that's a very important thing as well.
No, of course. John, that if you could kind of reflect on what you're seeing in the new build sector and I guess the other areas where HBS are active.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the panel as well, Matt. And really interesting, John, what you mentioned earlier as well. You won't be surprised, so we've been installing solar and renewable technologies for about 15 years now at HBS New Energies. And as with John, it's a very buoyant time, organic growth around it. But the question remains is, can we get to tripling that demand for solar and renewables? And there is a lot of reasons why I think actually tripling is quite conservative in the new build market. So there's there's customer sentiment. So it's no longer seen as a horrible thing to put solar on your roof. They're a lot better looking now. The new inline solar systems that we provide go flush, take away the tiles that are underneath it. So look absolutely fantastic on the roof. So customers now want this as a badge of honour on their houses. They can see it. The current energy crisis has meant that people are worried about energy costs, and solar and other renewable technologies like battery can help insulate customers away from this. And that's driven by the fact that the technology is moving on the whole time. The size and the power output of solar has increased dramatically and the costs have come down, making it the economics a lot better for end users and for companies to install solar panels on there. Not to mention the availability of solar is a lot easier for people now. So it's very circular economy now. We're talking about increase of green mortgages or green financing for end customers, which works for the banks because they get their EPC ratings up. Their customers are less likely to default because their energy costs are lower, and the customer saves money on their energy bills. But what I really want to say about solar and other renewables is how they're enabling other decarbonisations part of it. So you mentioned earlier, Matt, yourself, the electrification of heat and transport. When you take away the gas grid and you put on millions and millions of electric vehicles that need to be charged, you need to power these some way, and we can't just have that extra demand coming straight from the grid, especially at peak times. So you're going to need to generate more and more on the roof. You're going to need to store more locally, whether that be on an individual house basis or a development basis, and you're going to need to be able to offset that and feed it back and help balance the grid on that side of things there. So it all goes together, and it's not just one technology that's going to do this, but then if you optimise them all with home energy management systems or combine them with green energy tariffs, the likes of what OVO have or Octopus have with time of use tariffs, you really can have a win-win for all concerned here. And that's why actually it's a really bright future for solar and other renewables in the renewable sector, and one which we see a dramatic growth coming.
Fantastic. No, I think it's great to hear that buoyancy, and that it's obviously aligns with a lot of what the government has been committing to around that kind of increasing the number of houses that are being built, but also around the rollout of EVs, heat, and I think that now kind of solar catching up to your point, John, moving just from being a box ticking exercise to being something that's actually designed to maximise its utility, and that hopefully I think that certainly we see kind of that those who are leading the sector that moving from beyond that box ticking, and that I think that the regulation is slowly going to be pushing those laggards towards that case.
It's a really easy one as well, Matt. So in the new build sector, it's a lot easier to put solar battery on a new build house than it is on a retrofit house as well. You've already got the scaffolding there. You don't have to put the tiles on there, so it's cheaper. It's much easier to have a full system there than an old Victorian house that's got a single brick with no insulation and a terrible pyramid pitch roof. So it's a really good sector to do this, and the demand is coming. So our customers, the developers, their customers are going to be demanding these features and technologies of them, and that's what we're here to support them on.
Fantastic. Jason, over to yourself. I think that you have a great perspective as a distributor, being able to see the varying different approaches that your customers are taking, and being able to get that bird's eye view over what's going in the rooftop sector.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Matt. Just to echo what the two Johns have both said, just seeing this massive demand and massive growth. So Seagen, as you pointed out, being the largest distributor in the UK, we see this, but it is global. And in previous sessions, we talked about making ourselves attractive to the global industry. We see demand in Europe, where we also have a presence, and in South Africa. Everybody is pushing now for solar. It is an accepted form of technology. Everybody wants that on their rooftops or for utility scale as a means to provide energy. So we have to find that way of being an attractive industry. But for us, we have seen this massive demand, and John talked about ripping up the business plan, and we kind of almost did the same. We set a 5-year business plan just at the beginning, after the after effects of the COVID first lockdown, and we're already at year 2, because we've gone way beyond what our ambitious targets were for year 1. We're almost achieved 2 years worth of growth because of demand. And so this is one of the biggest singular things, and I echo the sentiment that's saying, well, tripling of solar, we can probably do more. There's a number of factors, and I'm sure we'll get on to talking about them in due course. There's a number of factors that will probably challenge that, but the sentiment is there, the willingness is there. We see it from a number of industries, the food sector. They've been very buoyant during COVID. They're investing in their property fleet and putting solar panels on their rooftop, because it is a dead space, but it's a space that can start earning revenue and solving some of the energy challenges that they have. The residential sector, we've seen a number of different factors come into play where more a number of people have disposable income. They couldn't go on holiday. They couldn't spend money in restaurants because of some of the challenges. They're investing in their home. And the rising cost of energy is just making that a more and more attractive sentiment in their own mind. They're not worried about the payback. They're not worried about the cost. They're thinking, this is something I can do to make my bills lower. And going on to Lord Debon's point, it's not how many kilowatts they've got on the roof, it's how much can I save? And we've got to be truthful in how we portray that. So, and very, very honest in how that can be done. So there's a real demand. I think we've reached a tipping point in how solar is perceived, and how solar will be adopted by so many different sectors that there's just such a pent-up demand. People are desperately wanting solar, and that's all we see.
Fantastic. No, and I think that I think hearing about that tipping point, that widespread, significant growth, and that kind of coming from a variety of different angles, points to a bright future as we look to try and enable the growth that we as an industry need to deliver to be able to kind of fulfill, I guess, the potential of the technology in the sector, and that being able to help deliver on the wider sort of national targets, that you mentioned there that the recent, I guess, energy price rises that has, I think, changed a lot of consumers and individuals' perception of the energy that they're using and forced them to kind of reconsider their relationship with energy. I think it'd be interesting to pick up that how you're seeing that playing through in the conversations that have been being had. That is it a fundamental shift? That is it something where that it's just more of a marginal change? That is, have any of you got anything to add there?
Yeah, so from our side, it just makes the conversations a lot easier to start, you know, because it's very topical at the moment. So people are worried about energy prices. They are worried about the source of energy, and all stemming from the gas prices as well also works. So it just opens the doors to the conversations about electrifying the grid and decarbonising those electrons. And the best source of that, the cheapest, most reliable, lowest maintenance is solar, you know, and it just works. And then if you start combining that with other technologies, it just opens up for me, it's opened up those conversations, and people are more willing to talk to us and request information about it rather than us having to knock down those doors that way around. So yeah, it's very topical, and you know, the prices are worrying, and you only see how many energy companies have gone bust as a result of it. But for the sector, it just highlights the value there is that has always been there, but is increasing all the time.
I think what we're seeing is that acceleration, aren't we, of people's decision making. They've been, should I, shouldn't I put it on my roof, you know, particularly in the retrofit market. And now it's all of a sudden, yeah, I'm going to do this now, because all I can hear is energy prices going up. They will go up again in March when the energy cap is reviewed again. And people are going, now is the time. I've got a little bit of money in the bank. It's doing nothing with interest rates. I might as well invest in my property. At least I'll get a return off that that far outweighs what I could do with just leaving it in the bank. So I think we're seeing this real acceleration of decision making, that people say, yeah, I want it. And probably John will find as an installer, I know more in the new build sector, but it is now getting to that point of they're queuing up, literally queuing up, where only a year ago, a lot of people looking at leads and lead generation. Now people are just literally lining up to get solar put on their roof. It is something that people really do want.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what we're seeing at the moment is generally companies have got long-term plans, 5-year, 10-year plans and things, and solar and renewables and, you know, 2035 targets and things like that. Solar's in there anyway. They're talking about carbon, they're talking about energy saving, they're talking about decarbonisation for their entire business. Solar is a factor in that. The high energy price at the moment is possibly could be a temporary thing. But at the moment, it's a shot in the arm. It's that extra thing that adds. It focuses the mind a little bit. And also, what people are finding at the moment with the high energy prices, it's that extra risk to the business. If you're building you've got a production line and you're building stuff in a factory, you want to know what your energy price is 1 year, 2 year, 3 year in the future. And solar can give that reassurance. It's already an attractive levelized cost of energy. It's your pence per kilowatt hour or unit of energy is already low or lower than the grid, and will continue to be so for a number of years. But equally, it gives you that static pence per kilowatt hour for 10, 15, 20 years on your roof that you control. The other element that we're seeing at the moment is where people are looking at how much more control do they have on their industrial units and new build parks. So where you've got big box developers building out stuff for the mail order market and warehouses up and down the motorways. As you drive up and down, you see these large skeletal structures of steel being erected. Those developers are looking at how they can basically put solar on a number of those units and control which units use the solar. So we've installed a private smart grid in Rugby, where there is one owner of the whole park. There is only solar on one of the units there, but that unit distributes energy to the whole park. So all the customers, all the tenants in that park use that energy, and that developer can control where the renewable energy is used, and then basically adds a better business case for the owner of the solar park and the solar panels, because all of the tenants benefit from that rather than just a single tenant in that unit. And I think with we're seeing that element in the new build sector as well. There's some great work being done up at University of Nottingham at the moment with housing development, with some solar panels on a number of different houses feeding back into a smart grid, supported by a battery, supported by a global heat pump. And it's that control of that energy and that shift of that energy that it's really exciting. What's happening in the commercial sector is trickling down into the new build and housing sector as well.
Absolutely, and in fact, one of the benefits of the technology, they work fantastically well on an isolated case. So on an individual house, it works. The economics work, and for a new build, it works brilliantly because you can buy it into your mortgage, for example, and spread it over 25, 30 years. But then you've got the opportunity to do site-wide work. So you combine those assets together and then localise grids. And it really does accelerate and multiply the benefits that you get from solar storage and other technologies around it all. So absolutely, John. I mean, but the fact is that they work on an individual basis and on a site-wide basis. So you don't need to be worried about having to share your free electrons with your neighbours if you don't want to. But if you want to feed into it, there are even greater gains you can do from this.
Yeah, and I think that certainly that kind of echoes that what I've been seeing in conversations that I've been having in the sector, that there does seem to be a significant increase in interest, I guess an acceleration of people in their decision making, but that in the commercial sector that things take a long time, that the decision making process isn't quick, and that it's far from a simple process to get from sort of an idea to having the buy-in from all of the necessary stakeholders and kind of permitting to deliver it. Is there anything that you can see that would further kind of facilitate or accelerate that speed of idea to installation?
Well, I mean, last week in the budget, Rishi Sunak was very generous and suspended business rates for solar PV on till 2035, which is enormously helpful and makes a really, really good business case look even better, and also will be a welcome relief for many of our clients who have been paying business rates up till now. There used to be a way of having a third-party usage of electricity, which attracted a lower rate of business rate. Now we're not messing around with strange commercial structures to have tax efficiency. And I think that will really improve the message. Equally, landlords and tenants, whether they use electricity or the landlords, obviously you've got the buildings, are both much more focused on the carbon reduction for their buildings and for their usage. And so it makes those conversations a lot more easier and a lot more kind of collaborative. So where you've got landlords, they're saying, how can we put solar on our portfolio to make our portfolio green, and how can our tenants benefit from that? Whereas before it was more a case of, well, our tenant wants to do this, or what's that? I don't know what the situation is. Will if those tenants move out, will the new tenants want the PV system on the roof? And now that impression is very much gone away, and people are looking at solar as a benefit for when they're moving into a new building, as well as retrofitting it on existing and used buildings.
I think that's great, and that historically that's been one of the sort of significant challenges for the rooftop solar sector in the UK as opposed to other countries, is kind of the nature of the freehold, leasehold property structure that is kind of predominant here, and that certainly that it has been a significant block in the past where both parties aren't necessarily aligned, and that the use case of the solar wasn't necessarily aligned to the tenancy of the leaseholder, so that having freeholders bought into this as something that is likely to be kind of necessary from consumer demand, but I think that increasingly with regulation moving in that direction will be sort of help even further where it becomes the default. And I think that this was something that I wanted to pick up with you, is that the move to solar being standard, being default on buildings, both in the residential sector and the and the commercial sector, that what steps do you see to being able to kind of further facilitate that journey?
Yeah, so I can go in the new build sector in particular, but anything's first and foremost, you need to remove any of the remaining barriers to it, right? So that's a great announcement last week. One extra barrier removed, so it makes an easier conversation for everything. So there's no doubting that legislation plays a big part here, and in the new build sector, the Part L, interim Part L legislation and the future building standards will have a dramatic impact with the CO2 reductions targets that new builds have to comply to. Will mean a lot more solar going on the roof. Just because it's the easiest, most cost-effective way of meeting the new regulation. But that goes hand in hand with all the other factors that I mentioned earlier. And that's the great thing about it. It's not just driven by legislation now, but legislation is something which is supporting it now rather than hampering it before, right? So whereas previously house builders were put on the bare minimum because that's what the legislation says they have to do, they now are looking to go by far and away in excess of the regulation even before the Part L legislation comes in play. So for the new build sector, we see a dramatic increase due to legislation from next June, and we'll see that just becoming the standard for all new builds. So new builds will just have to come with solar. For A, because of the regulation, but B, you mentioned it earlier, and I mentioned it in my first discussion, the electrification of heat and transport means that we cannot afford to get all this power from the grid. We have to start getting it and generating it ourselves. So there's lots of things around it, but legislation is a key driving factor to do that inertia, to stop that inertia and to keep it going, but lots of other factors as well.
Great.
I think, and it's interesting, John's point, and one you just touched on there, because I've always felt new homes was the easiest way to target solar, and has been for a number of years, and it's finally coming in, which is fantastic. But I still feel there's this reluctance to really go for it from a lot of house builders and businesses that say there still is that minimum. You drive past the new houses with 2 panels on or 4 panels on, you go, why? What's stopping people putting the maximum on there to go, this is what the consumer wants? We heard earlier that the consumer acceptance of solar is massive. So what's stopping people? Because the incremental cost at the new build stage is negligible, and on the total build cost of the house. So I think it's going to be really interesting how collectively we can push house builders to go, no, 4 modules, 4 panels on a roof is not acceptable. Put 8, put 10. You can fit that on. Why are you not?
We are seeing that sentiment. It's absolutely right. But we are seeing that sentiment changing. So we're talking with developers on a daily basis, and we're going to talk about the technologies, and I'm finding that it's the education about it. So you have the sustainability teams that are all over this. Absolutely, they're ticking every box. They've all got the plans, and it was just fantastic to see. And then a tender comes in, and it's how cheapest can we do this? But actually, it is starting to move for a couple of reasons. So one you mentioned there, the cost, incremental cost is lower now. But B, the understanding of the benefits to the end consumer and therefore to them selling the house is more understood now. Yeah. And it's when you start combining the technologies, I think they're seeing that the resistance is definitely reducing. And there's certain developers that we work with that go far in excess of the regulation and put 8 panels on every roof, which is fantastic. And the others, we're seeing it changing the whole time, but it's also changing where they put the panels. It's no longer being hidden around the back of the houses because people want to be seen to be green, right? They want to have that green badge. And so we are seeing that sentiment change. It's a slow ebb because the sector is very traditional. This is how we've always done it. But the seeds of change are there, and we're seeing it inch by inch, people asking for more and more. And with more and more solar, it opens up the business case for battery. And exactly. Then you put in an EV charge point as well, and then you try to put in a home energy management system that combines it all, and then the heat pumps. It all works together, and solar is an enabler for that. And we shouldn't be pitting these technologies against each other. They work fantastically together, and that's the point of them.
I think, I can't remember how many years ago, the Merton rule was brought in for commercial solar in the London Borough of Merton 10% of the total building energy use had to come from renewable sources, full stop, or else a building wouldn't be developed in the London Borough of Merton. And that changed the commercial building strategy of any new building in Merton. Where are the local authorities around the country insisting on the Merton rule, but for domestic stuff? Now, without batteries, as you say, John, well, up to a year ago, we all went up to work, off to school, and having lots of solar on a roof probably wasn't the most strategic way of doing it anymore. But you know, now we've got a deadline for no gas boilers to be installed in any new build. We've got EV being installed ubiquitously across the country to support the electrification of vehicles. And we've got the declining cost of batteries, and also we've got the transition to use electricity to heat hot water. Suddenly we've got the technologies that are there that can store the solar generation that we're all out during the day. Well, hopefully we all are in the future and we're not going to be locked down again. When we're all out, in the car, in the hot water tank, in the thermal mass of the underfloor heating. And then that 10% rule suddenly makes sense. Why not 20%? Why not 30%? I mean, we've got the opportunity, and also with smart grids on building sites, you don't have to have a battery in every house. You could have a battery on the side of a housing estate. You could have your a collective car park where your solar is feeding into a car park site from next to a school or next to an office. So the electricity has somewhere to go. On that estate, on that development, and then you can show a truly green development. I think it starts with local planning authorities and looking at maybe a radical step. It happened in the commercial rooftop sector. I think we can look at the residential as well and see where that goes.
Yeah, I'd love to kind of continue that conversation on the regulation, and that I do feel like that now that there's enough kind of leading indicators that consumers, that businesses, that stakeholders generally are in a place where that there's a much higher both acceptance and desire for solar more widespread, so that one would hope that the regulation is then able to catch up with the market and sort of bring in, increase the bar at which that those who are kind of just delivering the lowest standards are operating at to bring the standards up. But I think that there's another couple of areas that I'd like to cover while we've got time. I think that we've been talking about the buoyancy of the sector, that the opportunities for growth, the general sort of demand that exists, that as we look to the next 10 years and how we're actually going to deliver that I think that we can start to chart a path towards that tripling, but it does include the supply chain, the installers scaling up, that it involves there being many more people doing the work than is the case. That I'd be keen to explore that, both sort of following a couple of years of turbulent challenges, and as we look forward, that where do you see the kind of the state of the supply chain or the workforce? Is this something that you think that is going to be a challenge ongoing, or that is it something that will sort of work itself out and has just been a temporary issue?
Oh, you're all looking at me.
Supply chain.
You seem to be primed.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say this year's been unlike no other. The solar industry has always been fraught with challenges, and it's been very robust in how it's tackled those. But we've literally had everything thrown at us this year, and it's interesting that a lot of the problems are climate related as well. So, as people know, the vast majority of product comes from Asia, and there's flooding events in there, earthquake events, power shortages are all affecting supply chain. So these are serious issues that affect the supply chain. We've had numerous logistical challenges, all the way from the Suez being blocked to container shortages and blockades at ports. So it's been incredibly difficult, and will probably remain so for the foreseeable. And that's one of the interesting challenges for us all that we've got to face, and I touched upon it in the opening comments, because the world wants solar, and there's only so much being produced, and solar manufacturers are ramping up their ability to manufacture across all the ranges, from batteries, inverters, modules, and it's our ability to scale up and to do that when there's competing global demand for the same product. So I think we've got a real challenge ahead of us. And for us locally, we're seeing a real shortage of installers, and I'm sure you guys will echo that. It's the electricians, the roofers, and we're taking part in numerous areas to try and attract talent into our business, apprenticeship schemes, graduate schemes, making use of the government's Kickstart scheme to try and attract people into the business, because we've probably doubled the amount of people we've had in our UK team over the last sort of 12 months, and it's finding people and bringing people in fast enough, because there's a young people are really interested in renewable energy, but how can we get them in quick enough into this sector to make the industry really attractive to them? And that's one of the biggest challenges we're tasked with at the moment, and we're looking at each and every different way. So we've got a number of challenges ahead of us in the next 10 years to hit those targets, and we've all got to collectively work together, utilising the schemes that are available, and really trying to make sure we get the product into the country and we can then install it. So it is going to be one of the biggest risks to hitting the 40 gigawatts for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to add on to that is that, we've definitely got momentum at the moment, and one of the worst things for this would be to curtail the momentum with supply issues. Okay, so HBS, we've been doing this for a long time, and we've got a lot of customers that we can't let down. So we also want to make it easy for them, and it's quite confusing. It is quite a confusing sector out there. There's lots of products compatibility, hence why we've worked with global manufacturers and global supply chains to produce an inline solar system. So it's a one-stop shop so that we can supply that. But we need to manage that supply chain as well. And we're getting a lot of developers coming to us at the moment wanting to ring fence demand for their developments all the way through next year, right now. And that's something that we're working to do with the likes of yourselves and different distribution. But it's our job to make that our problem and not our customers' problem, and definitely not the end customers' problems. The end customers want solar on their house. They're not going to wait for the new build house to be built for solar to go on it, right? So that's our job to do it, and that we're working with our global partners to make sure that we don't lose that momentum, because one of the worst things is taking time to get the momentum. We don't want to go backwards now.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things we've probably faced more challenges with this year, securing stock from premier suppliers and making sure we've got solutions that might not be their preferred solution, but we've got a solution that will work, because using quality manufacturers and OEMs, that's a key factor in what we've been trying to do, because people don't want to wait. They want a product, and so that's what we've really worked hard to do this year.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, definitely we've seen lots of customers who have written commitments to put solar in their business plans for 2021, 2022. As Jason said, we've had massive supply issues and things like that, and what we're seeing, and also we're seeing is up till now we've had a very turbulent market, very sort of up and down in demand. So as a company and as a sector, we've tended to lean towards the small, the nimble, the reactive. What we need from sort of government procurement is several years frameworks of rollout and supply, because then you can employ a team of full-time installers to go around a lot of schools or a lot of industrial sites to roll out that stuff, and that gives us the certainty to have that employment and have that commitment where we have an overhead, and obviously where you have an overhead you also have a commitment to your staff to keep them employed, and that you're not going to let them go very quickly. What I found amazing in the last sort of couple of years is the universities have been rolling out renewable engineering courses and things like that. But a lot of them are not very practical. So we've had to, you get guys who know all the maths, but have never seen a solar panel actually installed. So we've got a lot of very bright engineers and new people into the sector that don't quite know how it's actually done. So that's been a real challenge for us, and then also we've been employing apprentices and things like that to upskill our workforce, expand that way. And we found out, you know, it's the whole range of the sector. It's a complex picture out there. It needs very simple communication to non-skilled procurers and people who are wanting to understand about that. And it takes a great deal of time to understand it enough to explain it simply. So that's been the real challenge, and that's with global supply issues. That's where we've found business the most challenging. The demand's there; it's the being able to supply to it.
Yeah, I think it's great to hear the experience that that you all having, and I think that it's something that has been, I guess, reported back from across the solar industry in the UK and more globally. I think that one of the lessons that perhaps we can draw is to your point that the solar industry to date has, within the UK, tended to operate on a relatively lean, just-in-time basis, because of the fact that it was subsidy-driven and that there was a large degree of uncertainty in demand, that perhaps in moving to a position where there is more steady demand, that the costs are more certain, that I guess that as an industry that will be working towards trying to build it up and reach that steady run rate, which I think that everyone has been harking for, and perhaps is something that can start to be delivered over the years, is that we're reaching towards that. I think the other point on supply chain that I wanted to bring up is that obviously the quantity of the materials available has been paramount. I think the other thing that is a theme that we've seen that's become more important over the past sort of 12 to 24 months is the sustainability throughout the entirety of the supply chain, and that I think that there's beneficially more of a focus now on truly understanding the nature of the supply chain, and that I think Solar Energy UK alongside Solar Power Europe have been focused on putting together the Supply Chain Transparency Task Force, which I think is an important step towards that, having greater understanding of the nature of the products that are coming through, so that it does feel like that supply chain, both having the certainty of product and then better understanding of where things are coming from, is going to be sort of a significant theme over the coming years. And I think that certainly that within sort of Solar Energy UK as well, that ensuring that we've got the right skills being developed in the workforce, working with government sort of education establishments to ensure that there's the relevant schemes for sort of apprenticeships, kickstarters, that sort of higher education programs, so that we've got the workforce we need. That I think that it moved beyond being anecdotal, where that you speak to pretty much every firm in the sector who's trying to grow, trying to hire people, and having a challenge being able to find people with the right skills. That some of the responsibility sits with us to kind of take on people at the start of their careers and train them, but that also that it's beneficial to have more of a sort of systematic approach. So I think that hopefully that's something that there's been increased focus on from government as well, in looking at the green jobs and the opportunities that this transition offers, rather than it just being focused on the costs. That this is a significant investment that is going to bring about a huge amount of innovation that allow sort of companies and industries to grow and become sort of global champions. That solar industry in the UK has been sort of a significant sort of international success, and that those have gone to have success elsewhere, so that hopefully we can continue with that. I think that in wrapping up, that I'm aware that we're sort of running over due to a couple of delays and shifts in the programme, that I wanted to thank my panellists here today. I think thanks also to the Solar Energy UK team for the programme to date, and to Energy UK and Renewable UK for establishing the Energy Transition Hub, and for RES for hosting us. That sort of two final plugs, that in sort of industry coming together to establish what a programme would look like towards solar delivering on net zero, and the push to trebling the capacity and reaching 40 gigawatts by 2030. Solar Energy UK have got a fantastic report called Lighting the Way, which included a number of sort of policy recommendations. That it's been fantastic to see government starting to deliver on some of those to enable the industry to move from kind of a business as usual case to actually being able to meet that net zero case. Also, sort of with a specific focus on the rooftop solar sector, that there's a value of solar properties report that came out a month or so ago, which is starting to offer the most kind of robust analysis around the financial implications of having solar on residential homes. And after sort of analysing 5 million residential transactions, have been able to start to put some robust numbers around the impact of that on housing costs, which I think that we're hoping to start feeding into the growing green financing sector and green mortgages. So that I'd encourage you to have a look at those. And without further ado, I'll say thank you and wrap up this session.